Hello, boys and girls. This is Grandma Wallace, and I have a story for you by Eric B. Hare called Dr. Rabbit. Chapter 1. Dr. Rabbit Finds His Special Place. Once upon a time, way down under in the country of Australia, there was born a little baby boy. His father was an Irishman whose happy face radiated joy and gladness, and who taught his children to look for the cheerful side of life and to laugh. His mother was a very devoted American lady, and as soon as this little boy could talk, she taught him to pray by repeating phrase after her. I was that little boy, and I can still remember part of the very first prayer. And when I grow up, may I be a missionary at the four corners of the earth, preaching the gospel. When I was big enough to say my own prayers, I still prayed that prayer. When I was 7 years old, at camp meeting, Elder E.H. Gates told us children mission stories and showed us curios from the islands of the South Pacific. When I was 8 years old, Elder R.W. Munson told us stories from Singapore and taught us to sing Jesus Loves Me in the Malay language. I knew then that someday I would be a missionary. As I confided my heart's desire to my mother, she often used to say, "And remember, Eric, my son, Sister White says, not more surely is the place prepared for us in the heavenly mansions than is the special place designated on earth where we are to work for God." Christ Object Lessons, page 327. So, somewhere, God has a special place for you where you can serve Him better than anyone else. "Where, Mother, where?" I used to whisper. "Oh, somewhere," Mother would answer. "And when you find that place, you'll know it. You'll know it is the one place God intended for you." I grew up and went to Avondale College, and when I graduated in 1913, I still prayed that prayer and was still looking for my special place. By this time, I had fallen in love with a very sweet young lady, Agnes, one of the daughters of Elder J.E. Fulton, our pioneer missionary to Fiji. So, naturally, I decided to be a missionary to Fiji. That would be my special place. "You'd better take the nurse's course, Eric," advised the brethren after my name had been discussed on the committee. "We are recommending that all our island missionaries take the nurse's course, not only for the workers' sake, but also for their own sake. You can never tell. Maybe you will be stationed many miles from a doctor or a hospital." "That's right, Eric," added Captain Jones. "A few of us are trailblazers, but we need medical missionaries to establish the work that we open up." I loved and respected the brethren, but I idolized dear old courageous Captain Jones. During my college years, I had often seen him and heard him, and in my heart of hearts, being a missionary meant being a missionary just like him. So I wholeheartedly took a 2-year nurse's course given to men in the Sydney Sanitarium at that time. By March of 1915, and with only 6 more months of my nurse's course to go, I was making good progress learning Fijian in my spare time, with Agnes, my own lady love, as my teacher, when Elder A.J. Daniels came to Australia on his way around the world to study how to reorganize the work of the church. I was thrilled when Elder Fulton introduced me to him. "This is my soon-to-be son-in-law, said Elder Fulton. I'm glad to know you, said Elder Daniels, and I felt his eyes looking right through me. You are Pastor Robert Hare's son. Yes, I nodded. Nearly finished your nurse's course? Yes, I nodded again. He was too great a man, and I was too unimportant a young fellow to say more, but those few words gave me a great lift. Maybe Elder Daniels would put a word in for me and help me to become a missionary the way I wanted to be. He certainly did help, but I had no idea how soon his help would come, nor how earth-shaking that help would be when it did come. From Australia, Elder Daniels went on to India, and in just a few weeks we heard from him. He sent a cablegram to Elder Fulton. We need a young medical missionary for a new mission station among the Karen spirit worshippers of Burma. Will Eric and Agnes accept the invitation? Burma, I gasped. What about Fiji? Added Agnes, equally nonplussed. Where's Burma, anyway? Maybe we should take time to pray and make sure God really needs us in Burma. We were all quiet and speechless for a moment. Then I replied slowly, I don't need to pray any more about it. I've prayed all my life to be a missionary at the four corners of the earth, and I believe God speaks through his ministers. I just felt something was going to happen the way Elder Daniels looked at me, and I am ready to go to Burma if the Lord wants me there. What about you, Agnes? There were tears in her eyes as she replied calmly, Whither thou goest, I will go. So we were married in June. I graduated from the nurse's course in September, and in October 1915, we sailed away to Burma, the land of the golden pagodas and Karen spirit worshippers. Pastor George Hamilton, the Karen mission superintendent, and Mary Gibbs, the dispensary nurse, met us at the Rangoon Wharf and entertained us with hair-raising stories of God's providence in helping to procure the land for the new Karen mission at Kamarung on the banks of the Salween River. They were already living there in temporary houses while the mission house and the dispensary were being built. Nurse Mary Gibbs already had her hands full looking after sick ones in the shade of the mango trees. She could speak the Karen language, and it would have been wonderful if she could have stayed on right there. But she had so much experience that it was planned for her to head up a new school for girls as soon as possible. This is why we had been called to be the medical assistants at this new station. First, you will be given 6 months free for language study, said Pastor Hamilton. Then you will roll up your sleeves and start right in with us. The dispensary will be built by that time, and also a bamboo house for you. That night when we were alone, I looked at my wife, and she looked at me, and our eyes were full of question marks. Could this be it? Our own special place? Would it? In 6 months, we could read our Karen Bibles somewhat haltingly and speak Karen a little hesitantly, so it was time to go to work. We traveled by river steamer and motor launch to our mission station. We moved into our little bamboo and leaf house, so kindly prepared by Pastor Hamilton, and with our sleeves rolled up, I reported to Nurse Mary Gibbs at the dispensary for duty the very next morning. Nurse Gibbs smiled a big welcome and pointed to a white doctor coat hanging on the door. I put it on and looked about. There were perhaps 20 people sitting around on the veranda and on the steps, waiting for their turn to be treated, or proudly showing off their bandages and describing the treatment they had already received from the white woman doctor. Some had sore eyes, some had ringworm, some had fever, some had ugly tropical ulcers, and most of the children had worms or a stomach ache. "Here's a man who needs to have a tooth pulled out, doctor," said Nurse Gibbs pleasantly. "How about you doing it for him?" "Me? Pull a tooth? Doctor?" Of course, I was certainly not a doctor. I had only a nurse's diploma. However, I realized that the Karen word for doctor was used for all professional people, and I could have felt very important, except that I suddenly realized that my nurse's course did not include any dentistry. I began to whisper, "But Nurse Gibbs, I've never pulled a tooth in all of my—" Nurse Gibbs was merciless. "Here are the forceps, the oil of cloves, the lance, and elevator if you need them." She placed a small tray in my hand. "And there is your patient." There was no way out. After all, was not this what I had come to Burma to do? All right, then, I would do it. I asked the patient to open his mouth and show me the tooth. Fortunately, it was a first molar, easy to get at, and it was very loose. I picked up a small swab and dipped it in the oil of cloves. I noticed that my hand was trembling. That would never do. Me? A strong young man trembling? I painted around the tooth with the oil of cloves and said to myself, "Mr. Hare, control yourself. Control yourself." But it did no good. The trembling extended to my arms. I picked up the forceps, and by the time I had fastened them on the tooth, my knees were knocking together. I broke out with cold perspiration all over. Then suddenly the tooth was out. I'm not quite sure yet whether I pulled that tooth or whether it just fell out from the trembling. "Well, doctor, you lived through that," Nurse Gibbs smiled knowingly. "Now see what that old man who has been sitting over there waiting so patiently wants." I went over and sat beside the old gentleman and inquired kindly, "What can I do for you?" "I need some medicine for my eye," he said. "Does it hurt?" "No, not much, but I can't see out of it." One glance told me that he had a cataract in his eye. I opened my mouth to explain that he would have to go to the government hospital for that, but he hastened to explain how it happened. "You see, 2 years ago, I had a fever. My head was hot, but my feet were cold. Then one day the cold wind in my feet began to work its way up my legs. Do you see?" He stood up suddenly to demonstrate the movement of the cold wind. Well, at last the cold wind came to the hot wind in my stomach. There was a terrible noise. I thought I would surely die. But the cold wind kept moving up and up through my neck, over my head, and is settling in my right eye. From that time on, it has just gotten worse. Till now, I can't see out of that eye at all. I nodded my head to show that I understood him, and tried not to smile. "And so," he went on, "I wish that you could give me some wind medicine that would drive the cold wind down through my body and out of my feet again. They say you have all kinds of wind medicine here." He was so serious. It was no smiling matter to him. "I will write you a letter to give to the doctor in the Maluan Government Hospital," I said. He can operate and you will be able to see again. We do not have the instruments or the experience to take that kind of cold wind here in this dispensary." He looked so disappointed. Go to Moline? Why, he had never traveled that far in all of his life. And where could he find money for such a trip? He searched my face to make sure I was telling him the truth. Then slowly he turned away and went back to his jungle home again, hoping that maybe, someday, somewhere, he could find some magic wind medicine for his eye. "Poor old fellow," I reported to Nurse Gibbs. "He doesn't know how much he made my heart ache. How I wish I could have been a real doctor. How it hurt to have to tell him there is nothing I can do and to send him away disappointed." "To be sure," agreed Nurse Gibbs, "your heart will often ache. But you will find that we nurses can care for at least 90% of the needs of these dear jungle people, and the simple thanks and appreciation of those you can help will make your life here very rewarding." For the next few weeks, I learned to appreciate Nurse Gibbs more than words can ever express. In addition to her 6 years of mission experience, she had been privileged to take a special course in tropical diseases. Every day I discovered things my nurse's diploma had not prepared me for, and it was she who taught me how to diagnose and treat the various jungle fevers such as malaria, dengue, and relapsing fever. It was she who taught me how to lance boils and sew up wounds and care for jungle accidents. And it was she who taught me how to mix our famous God worshippers' medicines. One morning as I reported for duty, Nurse Gibbs said, "You're a pretty good dentist by this time, Doctor. See what you can do for that little 2-year-old crying over there in its mother's arms." I slipped into my white coat, washed my hands, and went quickly to the crying baby. "Doctor, I think my baby has a toothache," said the worried mother. After a difficult moment, I at last succeeded in opening the baby's mouth and looking inside. To be sure, there were signs of infection. In fact, one tooth had rotted right out. I gently cleaned up the place where the tooth had been. There was still something white at the bottom of the sore. It could be a root of a baby tooth. I selected a pointed pair of forceps and tried to see if I could pull that white thing out. I pulled 3 white things out, but they were not pieces of the tooth. They were 3 wiggling maggots. "Oh, thank you, Doctor," cried the happy mother. "Thank you so much." The baby was fast asleep almost before I started on the next patient. As our patients increased in numbers, Agnes was pressed into the baby care department, and she was soon quite expert in washing and bathing them, binding up their sores, and administering the much depended on castor oil. One day after the morning rush was over, Nurse Gibbs went back to her room to work on the translation of a book, The Christian Sabbath, leaving me in charge of the dispensary. I was chattering with several patients who still stood around when a man came rushing up the front steps calling out, "Doctor, doctor, come quick! A man has been stung." "Where is he?" I asked. 3 miles away in Waikiki," he replied breathlessly. "Come quick." "All right," I replied. "I'll come with you right away." "It sounds pretty bad," I said to myself as I opened up my medicine bag. "Now what is good for stings?" "Ammonia is very good for stings," so I put a bottle of ammonia into the bag. Then I remembered that when I was a little boy, my mother used to rub the bluing bag over my bee stings. So I ran over to the house and got the bluing bag from Agnes. Then I remembered that someone had told me that onion juice was good too, so I put an onion into my bag. Then away we went through the jungle to see the man who had been stung. Can you imagine my horror when I arrived at a little bamboo house and found a man lying on the floor with his right arm nearly torn off at the shoulder? "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" he said to the man who had called me. "This man hasn't been stung. He's been almost murdered." "Oh, no, doctor, he hasn't been murdered. He's been stung." "Whatever in the world could sting a man like that?" I asked a little indignantly. "Why," he said, "an elephant." My mouth opened wide. My eyes bugged out. I felt wheels going around in my head as I realized that my limited knowledge of the Karen language had limited stings to bees or wasps, whereas, in reality, these people have only one word for sticking, and whether you are stuck by a bee or a pin or an elephant's tusk, you are stung just the same. Fortunately, there were other things besides onions and bluing bags that we always carried in the medicine bag, and before long the wound was carefully washed and sewn up and bandaged. Then, with his arm supported in a sling, the patient sat up. Wiggling the fingers of the injured arm, he grinned and said, "Thank you, doctor, thank you." Then, reaching out his good hand, he took hold of mine and squeezed it lovingly. My heart was full of happiness, and my feet were light as feathers as I raced home to report about my sting patient to Nurse Gibbs. There was a grin of approval on her face as she replied, "You'll be a great jungle doctor someday." She paused a moment. The grin on her face broadened until it spread from ear to ear. Then she said, "Do you know what?" I said, "What?" She said, "The people keep asking your name and I tell them Hare. But that has no meaning to them. Then I try to give them the meaning in Karen. But their language makes no difference between hare and rabbit." Then their eyes brighten up and they nod their heads with a seeming approval and they say, "Thar Paday, Thar Paday," which means Dr. Rabbit, Dr. Rabbit. So don't be surprised if you find them calling you Dr. Rabbit someday. That evening in our little leaf and bamboo house, I said to Agnes, "I like these people." And she said, "I do too." You can't imagine how I felt when the man said thank you and squeezed my hand. "I can too," replied Agnes. "I feel the same way when I put the babies I've been treating back into their mother's arms. Fancy them calling me Dr. Rabbit. I wonder what it is that makes them like that name." "Someday we'll find out," Agnes said. "And I suppose they will call me Mama Rabbit." She grinned. "Do you know what?" I whispered. "What?" Agnes whispered back. "This is beginning to feel like our own special place." Agnes sighed and smiled a very satisfied smile and whispered, "I feel it is too."